Hey, I'm Andrew Austin. Welcome to the FAR podcast, the vlog associated with the Freedom and Reason blog. You can see the address there on the screen. There you'll find over 400 essays on class, race, religion, culture, and a myriad of other topics. I invite you to go over and subscribe, read the essays, comment, like the stuff that you like. Also, subscribe to the podcast here. I want to talk to you today about left-wing trauma production for political ends. And so the working title for this podcast, I'm pretty certain this will be the title, is The Wages of Victimism. In an open letter by 12 University of Wisconsin system professors and staff, academic staff, as well as some administrators among them, if I recall. In this open letter, which condemns the shooting of Jacob Blake by an officer from Kenosha Police Department, the myths of systemic racism and implicit race bias, or if you find that to be too strong language, these concepts, if you like them, they inform the grievances expressed, whether mythic or not. Without evidence, the signatories compare the shooting of black men by police to public lynchings in the post-Reconstruction era in America. For my views on lynching, and I actually retrieved the archival data from the Tuskegee Institute, organized a group of students, and we coded those data and actually then carried out research on it, published 2 pieces on this, and I have blogged about it, so you can find that on my blog in a blog entry called Agency and Motive in Lynching and Genocide. I did a comparative piece. In any case, they say that black men by police to the public lynchings, so this is in the post-Reconstruction era, and then connect this with this. They say these public shootings are meant to instill fear in black Americans. So like lynching was designed, the assumption here that they make, and lynching is a very complex phenomenon, but they're saying it's designed to instill fear in black Americans, that these public shootings, and they say public shootings, I'll make this very clear, so they connect public shootings with public lynchings. So it's a spectacle. They want you to see it as serving some political purpose. And that's really reading a lot from this shooting. They characterize the shooting of Blake as attempted murder, their words. The evidence indicates the shooting was lawful use of deadly force, but there's an investigation. We'll see what happens. But when I watch that video, I don't see attempted murder. But it has to be attempted murder in order to then argue that it is a sort of demonstration project by racists to instill fear in black Americans. That's such a leap. It's an incredible leap. It's just not there in the evidence. So you have to imagine that that's what this is about. They substitute throughout their argument, and you see this throughout the literature on this subject. They substitute any actual evidence of racial bias and lethal officer-civilian encounters a cliche, and I'll just read it to you. Violence towards black people is embedded in the fabric of this country. You hear, woven into the fabric of this country. You hear in our DNA. You'll hear a lot of these things, and you should recognize whenever you hear those kinds of expressions, you should recognize that this way of talking about this, or other matters, this is mystification. The idea is to mystify what's going on with a cliche, using some metaphor. Their complaints come with something of a demand. At least that's what I'm reading. They want more black academics in the University of Wisconsin system. They identify the state of Wisconsin education system as an agent in, quote, addressing racist behavior and racial inequality in the state. Those are 2 very different things, but And so they are lamenting the underrepresentation of black faculty, administrators, and students. Now, so what they're suggesting is that we do not do an adequate job in the university system of educating people or marshaling the public institution as a force to address racist behavior and racial inequality in the state. They also are suggesting that skin color is itself instrumental in addressing social problems, as if white people cannot adequately address the problems of racist behavior and racial inequality in Wisconsin. And I presume that they don't envision hiring black conservatives, because if the problem is that we haven't convinced enough people of the narrative that they wish to advance, black conservatives aren't going to advance that narrative. So what they're really looking for are woke, progressive, left-wing types, and they want them to be persons of color. I mean, a white, woke, progressive, left-wing type could do this as well. But so they're playing the race card here, and they're hooking that up to a an assumption. They don't actually show this, but an assumption that education about systemic racism and implicit race bias and these sorts of things, that there's an assumption that the education is inadequate. Well, as far as what I'm looking at, we're having riots in the streets over this. I mean, everybody's talking about this, the question of systemic racism. So seems like they've done quite a good job. The woke, progressive, left wing types have done a really good job of priming public response to this. They've successfully portrayed the United States as a racist country. Not everybody agrees with that. I don't. It's not a racist country, but they've done a good job of getting people to pay attention to their narrative. They go on and they write, "We as black people do not deserve to die because large portions of our society, including law enforcement, feel threatened by our skin color." Okay, that's an assertion. They don't provide any evidence. In fact, the claim is made despite the fact that all the evidence shows that there's no racial bias in lethal officer-civilian encounters. I posted about this in a blog, "The Myth of Systemic Racism and Lethal Police-Civilian Encounters." I podcasted about this, so you can read about it. I'll come back to this in a bit. But again, they substitute for any argument or any evidence a cliche. They also sort of substitute fact and argument with repetition. So you have this manufacturing through repetition of a false perception about officer-civilian encounters. Now, then this perception is taken up by the public. So even when black motorists talk about how in interacting with police officers during a traffic stop, that the police officer was kind and courteous, respectful, etc., all of that, they still feel violated. They walk away from that experience feeling violated, and that's because of perception that they have, that there's some subtext, that even when it isn't apparent, there's racial bias. Even when it has no effect, it's still present. That's pretty success. That's a sign of success and getting ideas into people's heads that they otherwise wouldn't have considered because they wouldn't have experienced it. So they perceive it even when it doesn't happen. Even while admitting that it doesn't happen, they still perceive it. These false perceptions cause trauma. That is a sign of trauma. So a person is traumatized by racist experiences that they don't have, and it causes violence, as we can see in the streets of America today. Uh, these ideas lead people to believe they have valid grievances, and it's even shocking to suggest that they don't. I mean, we're supposed to um, entertain, be non-critical of false perceptions. We're supposed to humor people who believe this. And they believe that violence is a means for redressing these grievances that they believe are valid. And so the result of trauma production is not hypothetical. Since George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis at the end of May, we've been in a continual state of disarray, this country has been. And the chaos has spread throughout the West, despite most of the countries that are affected by this not having a history of race relations that resembles that of the United States. The protests and the riots are people responding not to what is known, not to what is actually experienced, but rather to what is believed. And readers of my blog will know the literature, either because they're social scientists or familiar with social science and they already know this, or because they've read a blog that I wrote that brought it up. But in any case, you recognize this as W.I. Thomas's definition of a situation, the Thomas theorem, which goes like this: if men define things as real, they are real in their consequences. We see this, for example, in religious thinking. Because men define as real such entities as gods and devils and such places as heaven and hell, they are moved to engage in ritual action and even to commit acts of violence against those defined as their enemies. They're also encouraged to self-loathe and all sorts of other things. Perceived reality affects behaviors and dispositions. So the protests and the riots are real. Their justifications are not. So the question is, how does this happen? How do so many people come to hold false notions? Working people don't come to such notions organically. Race is not a real thing. They would have to have been told about it. They would have had to have learned about it. George Herbert Mead, the great social psychologist, observed that it's the tendency of human beings to cooperate along lines of shared material interests. So in communities, the desire to want to cooperate is quite powerful. So you have to really work against that. You have to in order to sow racial division and conflict and so forth. And I mean, there are actual divisions in interest, right? So between capitalist and worker, that's a real division. That's a real those are the class antagonisms are the basis of real conflict over material interest. Here we're talking about something that's a social construct. Racial divisioning is an artificial separation. And people who know better, or at least should know better, we're talking about academics, after all, are choosing false perception over reality, as well as divisive rhetoric. And this is, in my view, because in addition to imbibing in the illusions that they peddle, the myths provide opportunities to express self-righteousness, manufacture victimhood status, manufacture esteem, and materially enrich selves by deepening in-group and out-group dynamics, amplifying resentment, fomenting intergroup conflict, etc. This is, you get a whole lot out of perpetuating the myth of systemic racism, implicit race bias. There are deep psychological and emotional investments to be found here. It feels good to cast oneself in the role of the morally superior, as well as to play victim and the sympathy it engenders in others. You know people who play victim. We've all had that experience. I mean, I would think we would all have had that experience. People want you to feel sorry for them. Not everybody, but you know people who do. They become angered when you don't feel sorry for them. Narcissists understand that people pay attention to grievance makers and admire redemption seekers where they've been conditioned to believe that such persons are among worthy victims. So you can create perceptions and then prey upon them. Again, this is the way religion works. The claims of religion aren't true. Nonetheless, they are opportunities for self-righteousness, victimhood, egoism, and so on. And I really hardly feel it necessary to do a point-by-point comparison to show where Black Lives Matter shares the core features of religious thought and practice. I have talked about it before on my blog. John McWhorter, the linguist at Columbia, has talked about it. I understand he's even now writing a book about it, so I look forward to reading that. But it is obvious. It's just to be elaborated and explained. Moreover, like religion, the ideology of systemic racism is functional. Only in the present case, the ritual of self-blame is dramatically turned outward, right? So appeals to systemic racism, implicit race bias, both of which are not immediately apparent and thus require special vocabulary. It's a scripture, if you will. It brings it to life, makes you see it, makes it real. This allows people to escape responsibility for the dysfunctions associated with attitudes, norms, values, habits that through alienation and by learning other blame, and that's a construct that I'm using here, other blame, think of that as a hyphenated word, for their failures, for the situations they're in. All of these work against integration and success in the Western way of life, an advanced technological society with all kinds of benefits and opportunities to self-actualize. The culture that's, if you want, subcultures that stand against Western way of life are, in a word, disintegrationist, and presently they're working out in an obvious and belligerent way. We see this in other subcultures as well. So rather than admit that the reason that blacks run afoul of the police in disproportionate numbers, and we see this in the fact of black overrepresentation in serious crime and the endogenous factors that lie behind that, or I should say exogenous factors, right? So there's a context in which this is happening, and then there's an adaptive response, which has become quite dysfunctional. These facts, and we haven't got it fully explained, but pretty much we understand what's going on. So the facts and this analysis are rationalized. It's rationalized by an ideology that blames racial disproportionality in arrests, convictions, commitments to correctional programs on abstractions and assertions that are reified by an elaborate conceptual apparatus. And this apparatus generates slogans that the devotees to it need only memorize. So the people who are regurgitating this vocabulary, this woke vocabulary that creates a reality that isn't real, they don't think too deeply about it. They're not social scientists. They haven't studied it, but they have memorized the phrases. And so that's why you hear this lockstep slogan. I mean, it's like everywhere you go, you hear this argument. And the same way that people can quote the Bible and they have a view, on religion, when they're not theologians. But they've learned, they've listened very carefully to the preachers, and they've liked certain slogans that the preacher utters. A lot of preachers just are sloganeering too, and so you're getting a lot of that. And like good propaganda, the abstractions and assertions are self-referential and therefore self-proving. So you'll hear often systemic racism and implicit race bias are pitched as causal forces, and you're being led to believe that these are independent variables, right? These are the endogenous and in some cases exogenous. In other words, that the whole structural world is shaped by systemic racism. People put race at the center of this, and so they ask you to identify with them these forces as independent variables. But then they don't bother to even specify them or operationalize them, to be technical about it. They just refer back to the fact of disproportionality, as if it's prima facie evidence of the thing itself. So Racial disparity is racial bias. But you would say racial disparity could be explained by lots of things. And part of what it could explain is racial bias. So you have to show the racial bias, and there needs to be an independent and dependent variable, being that the disparity is the dependent variable. But they don't do that. They substitute for the alleged independent variables the dependent variable. It's a circular argument. Implicit race bias must exist because racial disproportionalities exist. What other explanation could there be? And then when you deny it, um, it you know most people don't catch that what's happened there is a circular argument, that an argument has not been made, nothing has been proven. It assumes as given that which is required to be proven. So the ideology is like religion. The ideology is constructed from articles of faith. It's asserted as true because the alleged victims experience it. And when you confront the proponents of this view with the science that debunks it, and for the lethal officer civilian encounters, that's the entire body of literature, which is not insubstantial. The science is said to be biased. You'll get that. Epistemological demands for logic and objectivity are decried as white culture, which is asserted as an actual thing and declared a priori racist. Recently, the Smithsonian removed an exhibit on white culture, and among other things, it identified scientific rationality as an element in white supremacy. This is not a new idea. As you'll hear in my next podcast, I'm going to come to this. I'm going to do a podcast on the myth of white culture, and what I'll show you is this has been promoted in diversity training exercises for decades. They've been working very hard to put this imaginary construct in our heads so that we believe it. So it forms the ground upon which other claims can be made that we will assume to have been justified and validated. And from this it follows that any scientist who proceeds rationally may be subjected to accusations of being right-wing and racist, or at the very least problematic, as the postmodernists like to say. And then you see the efforts to cancel, censor, deplatform, marginalize, smear those who tell the truth as science finds it. And all its caution, we're cautious over here in science land. The reflection of authoritarianism that results from advocacy of rationally indefensible claims, we can understand where that's coming from. Those who threaten to debunk the claims with reason and facts must be shut down. Those who make the argument, the scientific argument, you have to get other people to ignore them, to say, oh, don't listen to that person, because they can debunk the claim, the anti-racist claim, they must be racist or problematic or something. So one of the terrible things that comes out of the practice of myth making is the manufacture of trauma. So to get to what I really want to talk about here, and this letter gives me an excellent opportunity to broach this subject. And trauma, to start off with, I want to be clear. There is such a thing as trauma. People can be traumatized, and it can result from actual oppression and violence, PTSD, and they're very real things. But there's also trauma that results from the belief that one is experienced or is supposed to have experienced or supposed to experience oppression. And the paradigm of this, and there's lots of examples historically, but the one that always comes to my mind is the McMartin preschool case in the 1980s. This trial surrounding these claims that children were the victims of sexual abuse by the McMartin family, the family that owned the daycare center. There was not a single conviction that was obtained in that case, which lasted for 7 years, the most expensive trial in American history, as I understand it. All the charges were dropped in the end. Why? No evidence for it. These children were led to believe that they'd been the victims of sexual abuse. The events that were described by the investigators and prosecutors never happened. But many of these children, now adults, believe the memories investigators planted in their heads. They believe they actually happened, or they can be convinced that they don't happen. They feel as if they happened. They are as real to them as if they had happened. This is true. Memory is not reproductive. Memory is constructive. You can create memories in people's heads. You can get people to believe things that never happened, and they will remember them as if they did. McMartin was not the only case in this particular moral panic zone, if you will. This includes the hysteria over satanic ritual abuse. I've written about moral panics in several of my blog entries. Mass hysteria. Most recently, I wrote about the threatening panic over the return of lynching fueled by the hysteria over systemic racism. See my piece, Death by Suicide in the Era of Black Lives Matter. The beginning of a moral panic, in which I talk about people seeing nooses everywhere. Exercise equipment looks like nooses. People just, then you have hoax crimes like Smollett and, faking a lynching, Chicago. And there are people who still believe him. Fortunately, that particular panic appears to have weakened over time, but we're still in the middle of a massive moral panic and mass hysteria. Two of them simultaneously, right? COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. The dynamic of implanting memories is also found in the ideology of intergenerational collective trauma. The memories may be real. In other words, the memories that become the substance of a person's trauma are memories of historical events that actually happened. But for most or all of the members of a group, because some things happen when there couldn't possibly be anybody who experienced them would be still alive, they're only vicariously experienced. They're experienced by hearing about other people having these experiences. Often they're several degrees removed from the real experience or the lived experience. In the pages of Frontiers, it's a journal of personality and social psychology, Glad Hirschberger pulls from the literature, including work from notable sociologist Kai Erikson. Certainly my sociology students certainly know about Kai Erikson. He wrote a book called The Wayward Puritan, and it was about mass hysteria. Kind of a little bit of an irony here, because Hirschberger is advancing this view not in a particularly critical way, but he does provide a comprehensive summary of the notion of collective trauma. So when you go to my blog, you'll be able to click on a link and read that. And I just want to quote some things that he says here. He writes that, quote, "The memory of trauma may be adaptive for group survival, but it also elevates existential threat, which prompts a search for meaning and the construction of a transgenerational collective self." That's pretty heavy. I find that group survival interesting, because you survive, if you say that we have these memories for group survival, then that suggests that there's an existential threat. But what would that be? And so I want to give you an example of the language of social constructionism that underpins this view, as well as the main tenets of the theory. So I'm going to quote two lengthy passages from Hirschberger's article, which is Collective Trauma and Social Construction of Meaning. So I apologize for the long quotes, but I just want to read this. So I'll go pretty quick. So pay attention. The term collective trauma refers to the psychological reactions to a traumatic event that affect an entire society. It does not merely reflect, and by an entire society, he's talking about like a society of Jews or a society of blacks. So he's talking about not, nation state or something like that, as I understand what he's saying. So a whole group. But also others who are not in that particular group are also affected, as you'll see. It does not merely reflect an historical fact, the recollection of a terrible event that happened to a group of people. It suggests that the tragedy is represented in the collective memory of the group. And like all forms of memory, it comprises not only a reproduction of the event, but also an ongoing reconstruction of the trauma in an attempt to make sense of it. Collective memory of trauma is different from individual memory because collective memory persists beyond the lives of the direct survivors of the events and is remembered by group members that may be far removed from the traumatic events in time and space. These subsequent generations of trauma survivors that never witnessed the actual events may remember the events differently from the direct survivors, and then the construction of these past events may take shape and form from generation to generation. So even the memories that are said to be intergenerational are not accurate. They're not true to the memories that provided the original substance. And this has everything to do within the construction of an identity, victim identity, of these events. For victims of collective trauma, meaning is established by A, passing down the culturally derived teachings and traditions about threat that promote group preservation. B, these traditions of threat amplify existential concerns and increase the motivation to embed the trauma in a symbolic system of meaning. C, trauma fosters the sense of a collective self that is transgenerational, thereby promoting a sense of meaning and mitigating existential threat. So this survival thing raises existential threat, but then you translate that into a system of meaning that hopefully mitigates that existential threat. D, the sense of an historic collective self also increases group cohesion and group identification that function to create meaning and alleviate existential concerns. E, the profound sense of meaning that is born out of collective trauma perpetuates the memory of the trauma and the reluctance to close the door on the past. So a little bit of a critical view there. And then F, over time, collective trauma becomes the epicenter of group identity and the lens through which group members understand their social environment. And I hope one can see how incredibly dysfunctional this can be. If you can't close the door of the past, if you can't let go of trauma, of experiences that didn't even impact you, and these things create all of these dysfunctional manners of thinking and dysfunctional habits, ways of acting that can really negatively impact. So you have to be critical of this. But people who want to protect their victimhood status, they want to protect this, protect their trauma, are very resistant to talking honestly, openly about this. Hershberger also discusses the way in which collective intergenerational trauma affect the perpetrators, and the language here sounds very familiar to me, and perhaps to some of you. Quote, for perpetrators, the memory of trauma poses a threat to collective identity that may be addressed by denying history, minimizing culpability for wrongdoing, transforming the memory of the event, closing the door on history, or accepting responsibility. The acknowledgement of responsibility often comes with the disidentification from the group. So if I acknowledge responsibility, if they say, hey, you're a perpetrator because you're a member of a group that oppressed another group, that if you acknowledge your responsibility, then, so if you think about the whiteness discourse, white privilege, and you should renounce your whiteness. And so in order to renounce my whiteness, I have to acknowledge my responsibility for the harm that whiteness has caused. And if I deny it, then I'm doubling down on my racism and my identification with the group. I'm sure you've heard this rhetoric before. So the victim group constructs a narrative of its trauma and expecting the alleged perpetrator group to validate the narrative. This is me now, I'm not quoting anymore. It characterizes the failure of such a continuation of oppression. You might recognize this as gaslighting. It's a type of gaslighting. You're being told that you're supposed to believe something that without any evidence. And so Hershberger's article organizes in a very clear and useful way the social psychological elements of what critical race theorists identify as the victim's perspective. and the perpetrator's perspective. And I blogged about this. See my essay on committing the crime it condemns for an overview, but it appears in several other blogs. This way of portraying the world suffers from what we call reification or hypostatization, which is um, where an abstract thing, an idea, a concept, is treated as if it were a concrete thing. So I'm a concrete individual. You're a concrete individual. We have concrete individuals. We can pick a characteristic that's also is empirical. I have lighter, I have this skin color. Somebody else has another skin color. And then I can say, well, let's group people according to these different skin colors. And then let's run some aggregate statistics. And I find that the people with lighter skin color have more money as a group than the people with darker skin color have as a group. And so then I say this is white privilege. But I made a huge leap there, right? I went from concrete because within the group of white people that I've just selected this one thing, skin color, and I've lumped everybody with that skin color in there. There's going to be people in that group who are going to be very poor. There's going to be people in that group that are going to be homeless. I can't describe all of them as having privilege because I have artificially constructed an aggregate and run some statistics on it and found that there's an average, a different average score than I found when I looked at another arbitrary group organized around a socially selected category like skin color. The whole thing falls apart. It commits the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And the crucial thing about understanding this is while the reification, the thing that's reified, is not real, it's an abstraction. Believing in it and acting on the basis of that belief does produce concrete effects, and you're seeing them all around you right now. So, for example, the experience of black children and young adults with anti-black racism is most often in past tense. It occurs back then because racism has largely been eradicated in contemporary United States. Now, the anti-racists want to deny that. They want to portray the United States as having no progress, as not make but the fact is that it's made substantial progress. When the country was formed, within 2 decades of the country being formed, it abolished the slave trade. Within a century of being formed, it abolished chattel slavery, and then it abolished more than 50 years ago. It abolished Jim Crow segregation, and even embarked on a program of reparations, affirmative action. So we are dealing with children learning from books, from parents, from pastors, teachers, television, about what life was like for people who look like them back then, and the horrible things that happened to them back then did not happen to children and young adults now. They haven't experienced those. So they're not experiencing what occurred in the past except through being told about it. If they weren't told about it, they wouldn't experience it. When they are told about it, they're also told they should feel trauma over it. And so the trauma experience is not caused by the concreteness of past events. Their concreteness is over now, but the memory is constructed from the abstractions of those historical facts. And the influencers in positions of authority encourage and in some cases insist that they feel the dead past is living trauma. And just, wear this albatross. Group identity is then constructed out of these abstractions. And so this trauma that's visited on black children is not the trauma visited by white racism, which they do not experience. It can't. It's in the past. But is visited upon them by those in their own community steeped in the ideology of anti-racism. It's incredibly dysfunctional. It's not fair to put this in the heads of children. And we see this in the elevation of cultural slights, faux pas, what we used to call faux pas, I regard many of them as insignificant, but we've elevated those to the status of microaggression, right? So rare racism is so rare, and this is sort of, I think, part of the evidence for how rare it is, that the attitudes and behaviors that were not heretofore defined as racism become redefined as racism, so we can have more racism. So we want, so we talk about racism in the past, and clearly when you look at the past, it's nothing like today. It's nothing like it was in the past. And you go, well, wait a second. So we both want to claim the trauma from the past, but we also want to manufacture racism in the present. So you can't make that argument totally, right? So we're going to get you both ways. This idea of collective trauma, the internalized oppression, is a central tenet of social justice education and politics. And that explains why it's so widespread in the West. Even in those countries in Europe that haven't had our history, believe they've had our history. They're using the words of our history. They're taking on the guilt that Americans are supposed to feel at the past. This technique of implanting memories in children and young adults, of really orchestrating an acquired set of attitudes and emotions, this produces a victim mentality in which the victim sees him or herself as the victim of actions and events he did not actually experience, and uses this trauma to define his interactions with others, to condition his choices, his responses, and that's a dynamic that will shape his future along a particular trajectory. It's sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. You find the racism you were told to look for. The dynamic reinforces his belief that he's a victim of imagined crimes committed by a living dead. That's where we're at. And, we could call this manufactured victimhood victimism. I use that term, right? The wages of victimism. It's a shared belief that constructs esteem, confers upon those with special status an emotional wage, a psychological wage. Not all members of the group, and I want to stress this, about which the victim narrative has been fashioned, suffer from victimism. And even under conditions of actual hardship. Many individuals don't experience the trauma or define themselves as victims. The trauma is temporary. There's no reason that trauma, this is part of the ideology of trauma. The argument of trauma is that when you're traumatized, it's with you forever. Some people, yes, but some people experience trauma and they get over it. If they're constantly told, you're supposed to, gosh, it's terrible what happened to you, feel bad about that forever, then the peer pressure, that social pressure can make people feel trauma when they could let it go. Might be better for them. It's not necessarily good to hold on to trauma. We know that trauma is linked to addiction and all sorts of other issues, health problems. A myriad of experiences are regarded as part of daily circumstance for many people who go through these things. There's no reconstruction of the self to embody victim identity. They never develop a victim mentality. Whether one is successfully conditioned to be a victim depends on how intensely the expectation is felt, the reward and punishment structure, the contingency schedule, if you will, for the behaviorist out there listening, because it's very much conditioned. How acutely demands for group cohesion and loyalty are perceived. That's tied in to felt expectations and contingency schedules. Moreover, there are, but a lot of people escape this. So we have to pay attention to the personality traits that predispose people to this. See my blog on the title of it's a fact-proof screen: Black Lives Matter and Hoffer's True Believer, in which I talk about sort of constellation of personality traits that predispose a person to take this up. And the need for attention and recognition is variable across the population, for example. So some people really have a need for attention and so playing victim. So that's why some people play victim and some people don't. It's not entirely personality traits, but it's an interaction of these things. And of course, personality traits are learned, in my view, substantially. But there may be some underlying tendencies in a person. it's important, if you've ever thought about it, if you notice this, it's important for those who think they are victims to have others affirm their victimhood. Now, most people don't see this because they're just affirming their victimhood because they think it's the right thing to do and they don't have a critical view on it. But uh, so I'm encouraging you to sort of take a look at this with some fresh eyes. You're being asked to affirm somebody's victimhood, and you're taking it on faith. You're not actually doing the research. When I talk to people about the evidence on the myth, the claim of a racist criminal justice system, I mean, you can lay it all out all day long, and they don't want to hear it. They just want to keep believing in what they're believing. So, they have investments to continue down that road, seeking the support of those around him through various strategies, including an expected suspension of disbelief that I just described. Don't ask the critical questions. Don't, is this person really a victim? No, don't. That's a bad to ask to have that. You should actually disbelieve as a default position. But using techniques like this, the victim enlists others in a project to validate the illusion, and the more those around the supposed victim are in their belief of victimhood, the more efficacious the emotional blackmail will be that demands outsiders acknowledge their responsibility in the trauma, but also in relenting to the demands that the victim is making. In other words, you did this to me, now you owe me something. And you say, wait a second, what did I do to you? I'm not sure I believe that you're a victim, because in order for me to be a perpetrator, I would have to have victimized you, and I don't think I victimized you. Well, but yeah, you did, and you did this because. And so the program of self-denunciation, your ability to suck me into your vortex of victimhood, benefits from personality traits that I have, self-loathing, and self-flagellating. In fact, I wrote about this in a blog entry that I titled "Such a Beautiful Moment: The Self-Flagellation of White People." The dynamic here really is sadomasochism. And so when you see whites get down on their knees and pray for forgiveness in front of a group of black people, you're seeing a sadomasochistic ritual. It's bizarre, tragic. Collective trauma becomes a source of solidarity, defines and intensifies the in-group, out-group division. It feeds conflict. It seeks a resolution of that conflict. If it does, not a final one, as I'll talk about later. It to the extent that it does, it seeks that resolution and the transfer of esteem and material goods and services from the out-group to the in-group. Esteem is fueled by the perception of self-righteousness, the moral superiority of the victim, the oppressed, or the immorality of the perpetrator, right, the oppressor. What the strategy does is it stands normal moral understandings on its head. Despite being the aggressor, victims can move under the cover of sympathy. They can paint the targets of their violence as the real threat, even portray the targets of their violence as deserving of the violence perpetrated against them. This is a technique of neutralization that David Monson and Gresham Sykes identify in their work decades ago called denial of victim. And it's achieved here by swapping places in the victim-perpetrator dyad. So you radically simplify the world with this rhetoric. You cast conflict as good, evil, literally in this case, black and white. You're on one side or the other. You're either a racist or an anti-racist, right? As Ibram Kendi, X. Kendi says, there is no non-racist. And so when you do this, in doing this, the social justice activist washes oppression and violence in a bath of righteousness. The movement is baptized, you could put it that way. Not merely cleansed of its sins, it's given an immunity of sort. It's a permission slip to sin in the name of justice. And that invites others, particularly those who are attracted to hate and violence. You see a lot of that on the streets. A lot of the Antifa and Black Lives Matter protesters, the rioters, the ones that are engaging in violence. They have criminal records. Many of them do. And so they get to join in oppressing the enemy, and then they get to cleanse their own desire for violence, because now it becomes a righteous, just cause. And then offensive violence, and we're seeing this everywhere now, and the media is participating in this redefinition of this inversion of reality. Offensive violence becomes justified by being redefined as defensive. This is a false transformational maneuver. While the defensive violence of the target is redefined as offensive violence. So shielding oneself from interpersonal violence, when you've been stripped of the human right of self-defense because you're a perpetrator, by definition, transforms the victim into the perpetrator at a concrete level. So one's battered face is guilty of having located itself in the path of a righteous fist, or a rock, or a Molotov cocktail, professional grade firework, whatever. And being concerned with one's own imagined suffering and having a very clear perpetrator identified reduces the capacity to feel sympathy for the targets of retribution. This ideology dehumanizes the victims. It's how it denies them the right to self-defense. They're illegitimate, even to defending themselves. The shop owners who want to put, riot-proof shutters on their businesses. No, the rioters need to break through these windows. It's racist to stop the rioting, to stop the looting. The victims have it coming to them. But the fact that you have stuff means that you must have oppressed somebody else. And even though the perpetrators of retributive violence were not wronged by any of the individuals they target, so you can get a little confusing here now. I'm talking about the people, the quote-unquote protesters. They were not wronged by any. First of all, most of them have been wronged by an imagined oppression. But in any case, if somebody's just out on the street that they target, that person they don't even know them. They didn't perpetrate any wrong against them. But because they share the skin color of the alleged oppressor group, extracting justice from any of them at random is warranted. Right? So it's an irrational thing. It's racist. And diminishment of empathy allows them to carry out this retribution or restitution, right, through looting, without the pangs of conscience. And state and local governments have stopped holding responsible those committing criminal acts on the grounds that those who are committing them are members of historically oppressed groups. It's like the employee theft in wages, or wages in kind is a rationalization that the person who's stealing at work, the employee who's stealing from the employer, I'm dissatisfied with the amount of money I'm making, so these are wages in kind. Looting is reparations in action, so lest they be portrayed as racist and reactionary, shop owners should stand aside and behold justice. And when all of the attention is placed on alleged wrongdoing and the suffering on account of it, compromise with the alleged oppressor is a remote possibility. So earlier I said that where people seek conflict resolution, they do so to extract something from the outgroup, right? So I'm committing violence because I want something from you. And I will look like I'm compromising if you give me stuff. But that's just if you don't give in, if you say no and you stop them from trying to take your stuff and stop them from blackmailing you, it's extortion, then you can get control of the situation. But if you start handing out stuff, they keep coming back. They know that they can get over on you. I mean, these riots, these lootings and so forth are happening in these progressive cities where the mayors are giving in, telling their officers to stand down, not enforcing the law. So compromise with the alleged oppressor is a remote possibility. Overall, there's maybe some moments where that could happen. And, speaking more generally, now we're being more specific about what we're talking about. And in this case, giving in is only going to make it worse. We have a positive sanctioned culture now of blaming others for the personal situation of some. And that eschews resolution because peace would bring an end to the psychological and emotional wages, not to mention the material stuff that accrue to the victim. So why would I want to say, oh, good, I'm glad we solved that problem. Now there's no more perpetrator or victim. Because if I can play victim and get stuff for it, to be allowed to break laws on that account, why would I give that up? And they won't. Through all this, there's no time to stop and determine whether the grievances are real or imagined. This is the thing that really frustrates me, that people have just assumed that all these, and it's been decades in construction, and this was the moment, right? This was the moment. We got an election coming up. We had the lockdowns. You have to ask the question, is there some objective arrangement or action that oppresses, or is it subjectively experienced? And to actually achieve justice, the writings of wrongs requires, actual wrongs. So if you're going to reform in the name of justice, you need injustices to reform. If you've already overcome something, then you move on. People want to have a civil rights movement over over again. We had a reason to do civil rights, in the 1950s and 60s. Now we really don't need to. And I realize there's a lot of young people that don't have their civil rights movement, and they wanted to have one, and now they think they do. They wanted to have their 1968 moment, the anti-war movement, so they could, that. But we've solved these problems, and we've overcome so much. We do have the class issue left to talk about, but we can't talk about that. In fact, we're further away from having class solidarity and having an actual discussion of what we would do about economic inequality. We've been in decades, and it's because people told us to organize our lives around race, which is racist, and not even think about class. But it's a privilege to talk about the class deal. So we need an objective analysis of the wrongs, of the injustices. And when you do that and you don't find them, then postmodernism saves the day, because postmodernism says, oh, wait, first of all, don't even try, because can be no objective judgment of wrongs and injustices, since they deny the lived experience, and since truth, whatever it may be, is really a projection of power. And so if we agree that we overcame these things, is it just simply a function of the power that benefits the people who will benefit from the fact that they can deny the lived experience. Injustice and oppression are how we feel. It's not what really is. But, if you stand back and think about it, that just proves my point. That proves the point of everything that I've been saying in this podcast. Black Lives Matter is set up as a forever thing that can only be forever because it rests on a mythology. If we were to be rational and evaluate the claims and find that they are severely wanting, then this would not be a forever thing. And it probably won't be anyway, but that means that there'll have to be different policies, different actions that the government takes. There's very little here that needs resolving, except this mythology needs to be debunked. And in order to do that, we have to assert our right to publicly challenge myths without risking life, property, and reputation. And here again, postmodernism intrudes to tell us that the free speech right is a white serving construct of modernity. Thanks for listening. Have a great rest of the day.